You are right. I shouldn't be appearing here in front of you. Nick was supposed to be back, but he seems to have had flights cancelled left, right, and centre, and consequently, we have to fill in. And I don't see how the poor man's going to get back. And America is a notorious place for being thrown off aeroplanes. But needless to say, we are going to deal with tangentially with airplanes, and it's I'd like to say that perhaps the story of the lifetime. President Cyril Ramaphosa goes to Ukraine and Russia via Poland, and his support team in the hastily hired SAA plane, which comprises 200 security men, about 11 journalists, and 12 crates of arms, handguns and other. The Poles said, "Oh no, you didn't. We have no paperwork for this. They don't accept sort of photocopied, sent by fax, sent by cell phone versions. You're not coming in." And Wally Roodt, who is Ramaphosa's head of security, complained that the Poles only spoke to them in Polish. So 26 hours later, that plane was turned around and sent back while Cyril was going to Kiev and Moscow, seemingly in fine shape without having anyone personally threaten him, but that doesn't leave much open in that regard, because his spokesman on that trip denied that the delegation had to be sent back to their hotel because of missile strikes from Russia. The press reports I've read said they had to, there were missile strikes in Russia at that time towards Kiev. So I would have thought that would just make a considerably great experience in the world of international politics, but not according to Cyril's spokesman. Michael, you broke the story for the Daily Friend, for the IRR on Friday, because you happened to be up at the sort of wee hours of the morning and happened to come across this coincidentally. Is this an embarrassment, or are we the victims of an international conspiracy?
Yeah, I certainly don't think it's an international conspiracy. It's profoundly embarrassing, really, when one looks at all the detail. I must say right from the outset that all credit for my being alerted to the incident goes to Peter du Toit, the assistant editor of investigations at News 24, who was actually on the plane, and given his experience and his years in the job, he clearly saw a good story as it was brewing. And from his very first tweet, one becomes aware of a journalist keeping his ears and eyes open and finding out where literally the scale of the disaster as it unfolded. And he has, in his reporting ever since, provided us with a kind of great insights and little details like the fact that this plane, which in a sense went nowhere, so kind of flew all the way there and flew all the way back, and none of the people on board did what they were supposed to be doing, except Peter du Toit, cost the taxpayers something like 14 to 16 million. So it's really quite an extraordinary thing. His piece was that today. Let me just see the deadline. 7 hours ago, early this morning, Peter du Toit's piece on News 24 begins by saying, "It would be easy to dismiss, as many have done, the folly that was the European misadventures of President Cyril Ramaphosa's security personnel with a giggle and a grin before moving on to more important matters." And yet he says, although there are indeed more important matters, not least the NHI Bill being passed by the National Assembly last week, profound disaster in the making, if ever there was one, he goes on to make the case that this actually represents exactly what is wrong in the country, and a kind of provides an anatomy of the disaster in the making that is ANC rule. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of other aspects of this we get to discuss, but it's quite clear from the outset this was a shambolic affair.
Well, I think Peter du Toit is right. it's the sort of extraordinarily, apparently clumsy set of circumstances that, South Africa shouldn't be getting itself into. I mean, they've had 30 years of experience with it, but we're also not clear about who is controlling what. And I would have thought that the Ministry of International Affairs or Foreign Affairs, I keep forgetting what it's actually called, and cooperation, would ultimately be the ministry that would hold everything together. So every other ministry that might be involved or department would have to coalesce under the under the headship of Naledi Pandor and her colleagues. And yet it seems to have literally taken off in a range of different tangents. I mean, there two things, perhaps, Morris, I can get your view on. The one is that, it seems to be, it was like a supercharged blue light brigade. The number of people involved in security was huge. I don't know what they thought the Poles would do with their weapons, because very often when people do travel, not only is the security provided by the host nation, but very often security will be disarmed, so to speak. So here we have 100 people with guns. I think I would be pretty pissed off if I were a member of the Polish authorities. But Wally Rueda, the security chief, has complained that the Poles were in fact being racist towards South Africa and about the circumstances. Your views on the size of the security and whether the Polish response was racist?
Well, I think this can actually be linked to the NHI, and it shows how the South African government and the ANC are captured by magical thinking. So nobody knows how we're going to pay for the NHI, but Joe Pachla and Nicholas Crisp just say it's going to happen, and something will happen. Same with this taking all these crates of arms to Europe. It'll sort itself out when we get there. There's no plan has been made. Like, this is what, okay, if they want to take arms, I mean, I'm sure when Joe Biden travels overseas, I'm sure his entourage is armed and so on. So, but I'm sure he does. The American government will do things properly. The correct permits will be secured and so on. So it seems also another issue was that the plane wasn't even supposed to land in Warsaw. It was supposed to land in another part of Poland. There was a town that starts with an R. I can't remember what the town was called. So it was also, nothing was done properly. Obviously the correct permits weren't secured in the beginning. And the issue of racism, I mean, this is obviously something that's quite hard to prove. And I was thinking, would this kind of thing happen to a leader? Say, would this happen to the Australian Prime Minister or Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, or whatever? And I don't think it would. And I think it would happen to his entourage. But also, it wouldn't happen because the proper procedures would have been followed. I'm sure Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, wouldn't arrive in Poland. First, his plane wouldn't go the wrong airport, and he wouldn't rock up with 100 security personnel and all kinds of rifles and so on in the hold. So, as I said, it's hard to prove or disprove one of these kinds of things, but I'm always a bit skeptical of shouting racism if there's not really any proof of it, and I think this is one of those issues. And if if everything had been followed as it should have been, everybody wouldn't let off the plane. The things would have gone off smoothly, but obviously they weren't. We cut corners as a South African government, and I think South Africans in general like to do, and things weren't done properly, and now we're sitting with the situation, and South Africa's a laughing stock of the world. I saw Ryan Coetzee, who used to be quite involved with the DA and so on. I think he was a DA MP. I think he lives in the UK now. He said normally, he's got his UK Twitter, British people who comment on various things around the world. He said nobody ever really comments on South Africa, but now there's been a lot of commenting on South Africa, and I think, South Africa is now getting known around the world. If people talk about South Africa, it's because there's no electricity or because the president of the country has been detained in Poland or whatever the case is. People don't talk about South Africa and think about a successful country that's doing things properly. They think about a place that's a shambles and falling apart.
Michael, it strikes me two things. One is that it's perhaps a sign of maybe some bizarre inferiority complex or insecurity that we have these large displays of power, and particularly in this context. I mean, a blue light brigade pissing us off on a motorway is very different to getting to Poland and causing a diplomatic incident. I think what's particularly worrying about this is, first of all, they had all these arms that, from one report I read, said, it was really to protect the president in case of, of war. And I thought, he's got to be kidding. And then there's the other, is the surrounding themselves with way too much paraphernalia. It doesn't reflect our importance as a nation. I mean, Joe Biden, and there are lots of criticisms about him in many respects. He went to Poland not that long ago, successfully spoke in front of an old castle by the looks of things, very impressive. As Morris said, this is just not going to be the sort of thing that a country, particularly like ours, which has almost more overseas missions than any other, would be doing at this stage. And it gives one an impression of incompetence, insecurity, a failure to understand the nuance of international politics. Maybe it is the ultimate display of what is wrong with the way the ANC is governing the country.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. One has the impression of a profound superiority illusion, if you like. A party that believes its importance is far, far greater than it actually is, has completely perceived the context in which it's operating, the objectives it claims it wants to reach. And in this way, in fact, it distracts attention from all the things it says are most important to all the things that are, a disaster and either completely trivial and frivolous, or just plain unnecessary. So I think you're absolutely right. Have this huge security entourage says something about the actual insecurity, in fact, of this poor little state trying to sort of pretend that it's up there with all the big guys, and that it's capable of sort of joining in and making some meaningful contribution. And yet all it manages to do is to illustrate or demonstrate its own, a lack of capacity. I'm just looking at Peter du Toit's phrasing again. He refers initially to the rolling shambles, which I think is what it is. But it's the government's own portrayal of itself as having seemingly completely lost the ability to project manage even mildly complicated endeavors, because this isn't, after all, for a state, this shouldn't be a complicated business. You work with the host country, you clarify all the sort of basic fundamentals: security, movements, travel, who's doing what, who's responsible for what, who's meeting when and where. These things, State departments and foreign affairs departments of diplomats are doing all the time. Not very difficult, and yet we managed to make a complete mess of it. And then on top of that, to behave with such arrogance, instead of just piping down, trying to resolve it, we end up accusing Poland of being racist because they're simply doing their jobs, and they're clearly a little bit alarmed. They refer to unidentified persons and dangerous goods. This is clearly going into a kind of war zone and living on the edge of a war zone. They have good reason to be anxious. Also anxious about where exactly South Africa stands, and South Africa's antipathy to the West and to America and so on, its friendliness to Russia. These are all obviously compounding factors. But for South Africa then to turn around and say, well, this is racist behavior, is just completely silly, and makes us seem all the more silly.
Just to tack on to that, and it's the fact that the other three African heads of state who went there, from Uganda, from Senegal, and from Zambia, their delegations were much, much smaller. They had none of these problems, so they were, no one accused the Poles of being racist to them. And also the crucial thing is all three of them have, I suppose, what one could call a genuinely neutral stand on this war for reasons of self-interest. I mean, I suspect that fairly appalled by the invasion, but they need Russia, and Russia's been making huge entrees into Africa in general, and the grain is very, very important. To me, that kind of really aggravates the behavior of the South African government. I mean, it shows us up compared to what would be considered, let's say, a little more lightweight African countries. We were supposed to be the heavyweight once, we aren't anymore. Yeah. In a way, they showed us up just by doing the right thing.
Oh, yes, I think so. Marius, I'm sure you have an insight into that too.
Yeah, I think South Africa is not the heavyweight it used to be. I don't think. We're still the second or third biggest economy in Africa, but that's also changing. If you look at the African economies are growing, I think current trends, a place like Kenya will probably overtake us pretty soon. And the fact even that we're in BRICS is we probably shouldn't be there. There are other countries that have much bigger economies that are much more influential. And South Africa is also throwing away any kind of influence that it does have. I'm not saying that South Africa has to move in lockstep with US or Western foreign policy, but we're seeming to, going against what the West would prefer, or say, as even against our own interests, like things like AGOA and so on. As I say, we don't have to agree with the West on everything, but I think there has been elements of realpolitik here. If the US kicks us out of AGOA, I don't think it's going to be the disaster that many other people think, but it's definitely going to cost South Africa, and it's going to cost jobs and so on. And the West is, Western countries in general are a much bigger trading partner of us than Russia is. And also the kind of aid that South Africa gets for all kinds of things from the West, it's magnitudes larger than what we get from Russia. So just the elements of self-interest, it doesn't really make sense that South Africa is such a supporter of Russia. And even going back to the historic ties between the ANC and Russia, that might all be well and good. But let's not forget that the Ukraine, was part of the Soviet Union. So there's also those kinds of historic ties. And at the end of the day, South Africa is it's basically a rounding error when it comes to the global economy. And we do seem to have a bit of a we think we're more important than we are. And I think that's the hangover of when South Africa was quite a big news story around the world in the 90s when we were going through the transition and so on. That's obviously changed, and South Africa is definitely not as important as it used to be. I would imagine if you're in any big city in the world and you go speak to people who are fairly well informed and you ask them who the president of South Africa is, they wouldn't be able to tell you, I don't think.
I think that's right, and it's to use our dreaded word, segues very nicely, Michael, into the article Terence Corrigan wrote for this morning, I think, in this morning's Daily Friend. And it's essentially, the title is "The Illusion is Ending, and This is Good." And the essence of what he's saying is that we are at probably the lowest point we've been since the transition. And a case could even be made that it is worse now than it was in the years preceding to transition, given the despair that had arisen from an apartheid government. I'm certainly very inclined to agree with him, because I think it also it helps to diminish to some extent the ANC, the myth of the ANC, because the victor always writes history, and the ANC certainly did. But it piggybacks that realization, that realism piggybacks on all the dreadful legislation that's been passed recently, capped by this event. Do you think he's got it?
Yeah, I think so. And it's a very interesting piece. I highly recommend that viewers and listeners give it a read. It is the main piece today on the Daily Friend. Just a number of points that I've just picking out. He singles out somebody like Peter Bruce, who began as the beginning of President Ramaphosa's presidency as a cheerleader, and somebody who thought, this chap really is going to make all the difference. Post Zuma era, here's a new vision and a new dawn and so on. And there was that whole "we are led" narrative that became very strong, especially during the early days of COVID. and that's all. That's all gone away. And very strikingly, as Terence points out, Bruce wrote last week that it'd be far more effective for business to kind of get together and fund any opposition to the ANC, just get the ANC out of power. That would be its most effective contribution to solving South African problems, not working with the ANC, but simply funding any kind of opposition to get it out. It's really striking. But the other striking one was a quotation from Eusebius McKaiser, who apparently just before he died made a remark where he said, the kind of words where he said that we need to normalize mentioning the name ANC when telling stories about the economic and deeply personal impact of blackouts. And he was talking about load shedding, obviously, and Eskom. And that, he said that these are foreseeable, all these the problems with energy generation and so on, foreseeable consequences of corruption, state capture, technocratic ineptitude, and unethical and ineffectual leadership by the ANC misled government. Make it a habit to tie the story of Eskom to the ANC. That's really striking for somebody like Eusebius McKaiser. And Terence then goes on to make the point that, as he says in his final lines, the illusions of an ANC-driven revival, or the illusion of an ANC-driven revival, is dead. We can no longer count on this. It remains for those of us committed to a future for South Africa to say this openly and to act accordingly. And it doesn't mean, as he pointed out in this piece and elsewhere, Terence has written very considerably on the problems of creating a new civil service effectively, which is what we'll have to do. It doesn't mean that the solution is one election away, but at least the illusion that the solution is going to come from the ANC has now been eroded away by the ANC itself, chiefly. And this is a good thing. We need to get over the kind of sentimentalizing, romanticizing idea that we can always somehow patch up the ANC. It's always going to be there. It's always going to be doing, the people's work and so on. That's now receding rapidly.
Marius, I think what was most striking, one of the things that was most striking about Terence's article is that he sort of reminds us of the sheer extent of his support, which was measured very highly in percentage terms, well over 60% originally, and the support he had from the public-private sector. They saw him as the businessman. They saw him as the person who would lead us away from the terrible years of Jacob Zuma. And yet, it probably took a bit long to ask the questions, well, where was he? Because in the 4 years prior to his becoming president, he was the deputy president of the country. So he was Jacob Zuma's 2IC. Were we just desperately hoping for something better? Or were we justified in having that elevated view of him?
Yeah, I think obviously Cyril Ramaphosa, he seems to have a bit more gravitas than somebody like Jacob Zuma. But as you say, I think a lot of his the aura around him was kind of not really based in reality. He did pretty well in the business world, but he's not somebody who built a business himself. He was given shares and positions as part of the broad BE and all that kind of thing. He's not like, say, somebody like a Patrice Motsepe or even a Herman Mashaba, somebody who's built up a business. And there's many examples of Black South African businessmen who've done very well for themselves. And I don't actually think Cyril Ramaphosa is one of them. But let's also not forget, I'm open to correction here, but I think he's also been on the NEC from the 1990s. So he's always been somebody who's been involved in the internal governance of the ANC. And it seems that he was never really pushing back against the worst excesses of the Zuma administration. As you point out, he was deputy president from 2014 and he's deputy president of the party itself from 2012, I think it was. So he's been somebody who's always been involved in there, and he was the head of the CADA deployment committee. So he's not somebody who's, he wasn't like the little boy in the dark with his finger against this tide of corruption that's going to come in. But I think a lot of people they saw this person who they probably saw a man. This is somebody that they can work with, somebody who has been in boardrooms. And whereas I think Jacob Zuma, for all his faults, I think he was probably somebody that was seen as, a bit of a country bumpkin and somebody a bit more traditionalist views and so on. People thought, and people who are running business and so on, he's like, he's kind of a guy we don't really understand. Where Cyril Ramaphosa would be somebody, he's one of us. He'll sit and have a whiskey with us and, talk about sending their kids to St. Stithians and watching polo on the manicured lawns of the Nanda Club or whatever the case is. And clearly it came out that he wasn't. I think Cyril Ramaphosa in some ways is better than Jacob Zuma. In other ways, he's worse. And probably Jacob Zuma has been somebody who could control the ANC much more than Cyril Ramaphosa did, especially in the initial parts of his leadership of the ANC, until it became clear that it wasn't, tenable to keep Jacob Zuma on as president anymore when he was turfed out at the end of 2017, and his ally, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, lost as well. So I think there was a lot of aura around around Ramaphosa that wasn't really justified, but and I think it's all become pretty clear now. He's not somebody who's managed to get a grip on the party or on the country, and I think suffering a lot of those consequences. And I think a lot of the stuff that's probably happening with the government is happening without Cyril Ramaphosa's knowledge. I wouldn't be surprised if the Lady R was loaded with arms. I wouldn't be surprised if it was loaded with arms and Cyril Ramaphosa didn't know anything about it. But I also wouldn't be surprised if it was loaded with arms and he did know about it. And also wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't loaded with arms and there's all kinds of just finger pointing and the fog sort of thing. You muted, Sarah.
Apologies, I was trying to keep some flying aeroplane thing out of my microphone. I think perhaps what we tend to forget about or underestimate is Cyril Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma shared one facet. They're both very charming men, and you can get away with a lot with charm. I think I've said it before. I mean, I read one biography of Joseph Stalin, and comment that always made an impact on me is that for the party, it wasn't his tyranny or his aggression that was fearsome; it was his charm. And I think sometimes the advantage of not having charm is that you kind of know where you stand, and I don't think we've known with either president we've known where we've stood. But Morris, to sort of come sort of along those lines, but in a different sphere, has been comments made by Busi Mavuso, who sorry, I've suddenly forgotten which she heads
Business
up
Unity South Africa, I think.
Business Unity, I can never Business Unity or Business Leadership, and she's commenting about the NHI and essentially the potential disaster that is NHI. And if anyone hasn't read it, have a look at Chris Barron's. He has that little piece. He always asks a question of a celebrity or a politician, and then see how they answer him. And he asks Nicholas Crisp, who is the Deputy Director General of the NHI, who's the guy charged with creating and putting this thing together. And it is the most astonishing piece. I mean, the apparent ignorance, arrogance, or sheer I don't care about you guys one way or the other, and particularly towards the private sector, is quite astonishing. And Busi Mavuso has always had a sort of forthright reputation. I mean, both on Eskom and on other things. She's not a shrinking violet, but she seems to feel that too little has been said by too few people too softly about the disaster that is the potential disaster that is the NHI. Is she being fair to her?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, in her article, people on Reddit, it's in News 24 today, she says she's been surprised by the how quiet people have been about NHI. I find that a bit strange, as our organisation has been quite vocal on it. So many others, Sakalicha and Solidarity has come out, the DA has come out, and Intellidex, who's kind of a markets analysis company, and lots of other journalists. Sam Kokeli, I think he wrote something this weekend talking about what a disaster is going to be. So it's been coming from almost every quarter, and I've seen actually very little of people who've come out to defend the NHI. But just on Nicholas Crisp and Joe Pachler, what's been for me the most astonishing about it is when talking about how we're going to pay for it. And they just blithely say we're just going to increase VAT, or the current voluntary contributions that people make to be part of medical aid schemes, that's going to become actually a tax. And it's actually bizarre. I mean, this is people's after-tax money and to increase VAT is actually, it's incredibly cruel. It's the most regressive tax that you can get, because it eats up more of poorer people's incomes than people on higher incomes. And we just blithely say, okay, let's increase VAT to 20%. That means it's going to cost people more money, and that's going to come from food and so on. And as we know, people on lower incomes, they spend more money on food and transport and so on. That's people are going to be affected. And even apart from that, just to blithely say now that 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 rand or even more that you pay, especially older people, that I know they pay up to 10 rand a month for medical aid and so on. Just to blithely say this is going to become your voluntary contribution is going to become a compulsory one, and you're going to have no say on it. I mean, I pay my voluntary medical aid every month, but it's voluntary, and I can tomorrow if I decide for whatever reason, because I can't afford it anymore, or I want to spend the money on drugs and jolling or whatever that case is. That's my decision, and you can decide to stop paying that tomorrow. And it's just bonkers that people's money is seen as this this kind of thing that belongs to the government, doesn't belong to people.
Michael, just in a minute, because we've essentially run over time. The thing about the NHI and the fiddling with people's health is that it's almost, that's a stretch too far. It's the one thing that people will desperately avoid having done to them if they can. Maybe we'll even see something as sort of drastic as a tax boycott.
We could. I mean, I think where I certainly agree with Morris that there's a range of organisations have been very vocal and so on. But I think where Mavuso could be correct is in the sense that one doesn't get an idea that the public is out there on the streets making exactly the point that you're making. You're touching us on the one thing that is a step too far, and there's a reason why they're not doing that. And she says, or her interpretation is that many people have simply given up caring about it. They know the emperor is wearing no clothes, but scarcely anyone considers that remarkable. And I think in a way that's what Terence is also saying. The illusion is gone, but there is also, and I agree with Morris here, both of you on this, is that there's also a risk in this, is that we become complacent, and we don't appreciate that. Precisely because of the charm of somebody like Cyril Ramaphosa and the party he leads, and he embodies the party. He goes to great lengths to demonstrate that he embodies the party. He's happy with everything he does and says, that he's this charming figure. How is he? He's not going to harm us. He's not going to destroy our healthcare, surely. And that's exactly the risk, I think.
On that very dangerous note. Pardon us for going a bit over time, and I'm not entirely sure. I think I don't know, Morris, if it's you who's hosting tomorrow, in light of the sudden change of arrangements given Nicholas's plight. But I hope you'll join us then. And in any event, read us every day in the Daily Friend, dailyfriend.co.za, and we will enlighten and delight you. I promise. Cheers.